The words hung in the air between them like a bridge neither was ready to cross. Thomas Bailey stood in the doorway of their shared apartment, his fingers still wrapped around the door frame, watching as Alexander Harris turned from the kitchen counter with that look in his eyes. That look that had been appearing more and more frequently over the past 3 months, soft and searching and filled with something that made Thomas's heart twist painfully in his chest. "You're my favorite person," Alexander had said just moments before, his voice carrying a weight that went far beyond casual friendship. The way he'd said it, the way his gaze had lingered on Thomas's face, the way his hand had reached out as if to touch before pulling back. It was the same phrase Alexander had been using for weeks now, but tonight it felt different. Tonight it felt like a confession wrapped in safe words. Thomas felt his world tilt slightly on its axis as he processed the implications of that moment. The electricity that had been building between them for months seemed to crackle in the space between where they stood, and for the first time, Thomas allowed himself to wonder if maybe, just maybe, his straight best friend was beginning to feel the same impossible things that had been tearing Thomas apart from the inside. But to understand how they had arrived at this moment, this precipice of possibility and terror, we need to go back. Back to when Thomas first realized that his feelings for his roommate and best friend had crossed a line he'd never expected to approach. Back to when Alexander first started looking at him with confusion in his eyes, as if seeing something he'd never noticed before. Back to the beginning of the most beautiful and terrifying 3 months of Thomas's life. Before we see how this story unfolds, tell us where you are watching from and hype this video in the comments. Now let's dive into how two best friends found themselves standing on the edge of everything they thought they knew about love and friendship. It had started on a Tuesday in March, though Thomas wouldn't recognize the significance of that day until much later. He'd been living with Alexander for almost 2 years by then, a comfortable arrangement that had begun when they'd both needed roommates and discovered their friendship could survive the daily realities of shared space. Thomas had thought he had his feelings well under control. He'd accepted his quiet, hopeless love for his straight best friend as simply another fact of his existence, like his brown eyes or his tendency to overthink everything. Alexander had been dating Megan Ortiz for about 8 months at that point, a relationship that seemed perfectly adequate on the surface but left Alexander strangely restless. Thomas had become an expert at listening to Alexander's relationship concerns, offering advice that felt like swallowing glass, watching the man he loved struggle to find satisfaction with someone else. That Tuesday evening, Alexander had come home from dinner with Megan looking particularly thoughtful. He'd stood in their kitchen, still wearing his good shirt and the cologne that made Thomas's concentration falter, and had said something that would replay in Thomas's mind for weeks afterward. "I don't know what's wrong with me," Alexander had said, running his hands through his dark hair in frustration. "She's perfect on paper. She's beautiful. She's smart. She makes me laugh. But when I'm with her, I feel like I'm playing a part in a play I never auditioned for." Thomas had been loading the dishwasher, focusing intently on arranging plates to avoid looking at Alexander's face. He'd heard variations of this complaint before, but something in Alexander's tone that night had been different, more desperate, more confused. "What do you mean?" Thomas had asked, though he'd been afraid of the answer. Alexander had been quiet for a long moment, and when Thomas had finally looked up, he'd found Alexander staring at him with an expression he couldn't quite interpret. "It's like," Alexander had said slowly, "when I imagine the person I want to come home to every day, when I think about who I want to tell my secrets to, who I want to laugh with until 2 in the morning, who I want to just exist with. When I think about that person, it's not her." The plate in Thomas's hands had nearly slipped. He'd set it carefully in the dishwasher and had turned to face Alexander fully, his heart hammering against his ribs. "Who is it then?" he'd asked, though his voice had come out smaller than he'd intended. Alexander had looked at him for a long moment, something shifting in his expression. "I don't know," he'd said finally. "That's the problem." That conversation had opened something between them, a door that neither of them had been ready to walk through but couldn't seem to close. In the days that followed, Thomas had noticed Alexander watching him with a new kind of attention. Not the casual observation of a longtime friend, but something more focused, more questioning, as if Alexander was trying to solve a puzzle he didn't even know he was working on. The changes had been subtle at first. Alexander had started seeking out Thomas's company more deliberately, suggesting they watch movies together instead of retreating to separate rooms after dinner. He'd begun sitting closer on their couch, close enough that their shoulders would brush when one of them shifted. He'd started asking Thomas's opinion on things that had nothing to do with practical roommate concerns, deeper questions about happiness and fulfillment and what it meant to truly know someone. Thomas had tried to convince himself that he was reading too much into these shifts. Alexander was simply going through a rough patch in his relationship, seeking comfort in their friendship. It was natural, normal, nothing more than what any good friend would do. But late at night, lying in his bed just down the hall from Alexander's room, Thomas had found himself cataloging every lingering glance, every casual touch, every moment when Alexander's attention had felt like something more than friendship. 3 weeks after that initial conversation, Alexander had broken up with Megan. He'd come home that evening looking simultaneously relieved and terrified, and had found Thomas reading on the couch. Without saying a word, Alexander had sat down beside him, closer than usual, and had rested his head against Thomas's shoulder. "I ended it," Alexander had said quietly, his breath warm against Thomas's neck. Thomas had set his book aside immediately, giving Alexander his full attention. "Are you okay?" Thomas had asked, though his own heart had been racing at Alexander's proximity, at the trust implicit in the gesture. "I think so," Alexander had replied. "I think I've been okay for the first time in months." They'd sat like that for over an hour, Alexander's head on Thomas's shoulder, Thomas's hand eventually finding its way to Alexander's hair, fingers running gently through the soft strands. It had felt simultaneously natural and earth-shattering, this new level of physical intimacy between them. Thomas had been terrified to move, terrified to break whatever spell had settled over them. When Alexander had finally lifted his head, his eyes had been soft and grateful. "Thank you," he'd said, "for always being here, for always knowing what I need." Thomas had felt his breath catch at the words, at the way Alexander was looking at him. "Always," he'd managed to say, though the word had felt heavy with unspoken meaning. That night had marked a turning point. Alexander had become even more tactile, more affectionate, in ways that pushed the boundaries of their friendship into uncharted territory. He'd started reaching for Thomas's hand when they were walking together, fingers intertwining as naturally as breathing. He'd begun initiating hugs that lasted longer than casual embraces, his arms tight around Thomas's waist, his face pressed against Thomas's neck. Most significantly, Alexander had started talking about Thomas in ways that made Thomas's heart soar and ache simultaneously. He'd begun referring to Thomas as his favorite person, a phrase that had started as a casual comment but had evolved into something that felt almost sacred. The way Alexander said it with such warmth and certainty made it sound like a confession of something deeper than friendship. "You know you're my favorite person, right?" Alexander would say, usually during quiet moments when they were alone together. The first time, Thomas had laughed it off as a joke. The second time, he'd felt a flutter of hope he'd tried to suppress. By the 10th time, when Alexander had said it while looking directly into Thomas's eyes with an intensity that made Thomas's knees weak, he'd begun to wonder if maybe Alexander meant something more than friendship. But doubt was Thomas's constant companion during those weeks. Alexander had never shown any interest in men before. He'd dated women exclusively for as long as Thomas had known him, had never expressed curiosity about same-sex attraction, had never given any indication that his sexuality was anything other than straightforward. Thomas had convinced himself repeatedly that he was projecting his own feelings onto Alexander's natural affection, seeing romantic intent where there was only friendship. The internal war between hope and realism had been exhausting. Thomas had found himself analyzing every interaction, every touch, every word, searching for signs that might indicate Alexander's feelings were changing. At the same time, he'd been terrified of the possibility, afraid that acknowledging the shift might destroy their friendship entirely. The tension had reached a breaking point on a Friday evening in late April. Alexander had been restless all day, pacing around their apartment, starting conversations, and then trailing off mid-sentence. Thomas had been trying to work on his laptop at their kitchen table, but Alexander's nervous energy had been impossible to ignore. Finally, Alexander had stopped pacing and had turned to face Thomas directly. "Can I ask you something?" he'd said, his voice carrying an unusual note of uncertainty. Thomas had looked up from his laptop, noting the way Alexander was fidgeting with the hem of his shirt. Of course, he'd replied. Alexander had been quiet for a moment, as if gathering courage. Have you ever wondered what it would be like to kiss someone you weren't supposed to kiss? He'd asked finally. The question had hit Thomas like a physical blow. His fingers had frozen over his keyboard, and he'd felt his face flush with heat. The specificity of the question, the way Alexander was looking at him with such vulnerable uncertainty, had made it impossible to dismiss his casual curiosity. What do you mean? Thomas had asked, though his voice had come out rougher than he'd intended. Alexander had moved closer, coming to stand beside Thomas's chair. I mean, he'd said slowly, have you ever looked at someone you care about, someone who's supposed to be just a friend, and wondered what it would feel like to cross that line? Thomas's heart had been hammering so loudly he'd been sure Alexander could hear it. The question had felt loaded with possibility and danger in equal measure. He'd found himself staring up at Alexander's face, noting the flush in his cheeks, the way his breathing had become slightly uneven. Why are you asking? Thomas had managed to say. Alexander had been quiet for a long moment, his gaze dropping to Thomas's lips for just an instant before returning to his eyes. Because I think I might be wondering that about someone, he'd said softly. The admission had hung in the air between them like a live wire. Thomas had felt his world shift on its axis, hope and terror warring in his chest. He'd wanted to ask who, wanted to demand clarification, wanted to confess his own feelings right there at their kitchen table. Instead, he'd found himself paralyzed by the magnitude of the moment. Before he could formulate a response, Alexander had stepped back, running his hands through his hair, in the gesture Thomas had come to recognize as a sign of his nervousness. Never mind, Alexander had said quickly. Forget I asked. I'm being weird. He'd retreated to his room after that, leaving Thomas sitting at the kitchen table with his heart racing and his mind spinning. The conversation had felt like a door opening just wide enough for Thomas to glimpse what lay beyond, only to slam shut before he could step through. The days following that conversation had been filled with a new kind of tension. Alexander had seemed embarrassed by his question, more distant than he'd been in weeks. Thomas had found himself missing the easy affection they'd been sharing, the casual touches and lingering glances that had become such a crucial part of his daily happiness. But Alexander's withdrawal had only lasted a few days. The following Wednesday, he'd appeared in Thomas's doorway late at night, wearing only pajama pants and looking vulnerable in a way that had made Thomas's chest ache with tenderness. I can't sleep, Alexander had said quietly. Can I? He'd paused, looking uncertain. Can I sleep in your bed tonight? Just to sleep, I mean. I don't want to be alone. Thomas had moved over immediately, pulling back his covers in invitation. Alexander had slipped into the bed beside him, and they'd lain there in the darkness, careful not to touch, but acutely aware of each other's presence. The intimacy of sharing a bed had felt monumental, a level of trust and vulnerability that went far beyond their usual friendship. They talked quietly in the darkness about everything and nothing. Alexander had confessed his confusion about his recent breakup, his uncertainty about what he wanted from life, his growing sense that he'd been living according to other people's expectations rather than his own desires. I feel like I've been sleepwalking, he'd said, his voice soft in the darkness. Like I've been going through the motions of a life that doesn't actually fit me. Thomas had turned on to his side, facing Alexander in the dim light filtering through his bedroom window. What would fit you? He'd asked. Alexander had been quiet for so long that Thomas had begun to think he wouldn't answer. Something real, he'd said finally, something that feels like coming home instead of putting on a performance. The words had settled between them with weight and meaning. Thomas had wanted to reach out, to close the small distance between them, to offer comfort through touch. Instead, he'd contented himself with the warmth of Alexander's presence beside him, the steady rhythm of his breathing, the unprecedented intimacy of sharing this quiet space. They'd fallen asleep like that, and Thomas had woken the next morning to find Alexander curled against his side, one arm thrown across Thomas's chest, their legs tangled together. For a few precious moments before full consciousness returned, Thomas had allowed himself to savor the feeling of holding Alexander, of being held in return. When Alexander had woken, he had seemed startled by their position, but he hadn't immediately pulled away. Instead, he'd looked up at Thomas with sleepy, confused eyes, as if trying to process something he didn't quite understand. "Good morning," Thomas had said softly, not wanting to break the spell of the moment. "Morning," Alexander had replied, his voice rough with sleep. His gaze had lingered on Thomas's face, and for a moment Thomas had thought Alexander might say something significant. Instead, Alexander had carefully extracted himself from their embrace and had retreated to his own room, leaving Thomas with the memory of his warmth and the lingering scent of his shampoo on the pillow. That morning had marked the beginning of a new phase in their relationship, one characterized by increasing physical intimacy and emotional vulnerability. Alexander had begun seeking out reasons to touch Thomas, casual contact that felt anything but casual. He'd started standing closer when they cooked together, his hand finding the small of Thomas's back as he reached around him for ingredients. He'd begun sitting beside Thomas on the couch with their thighs pressed together, his hand resting on Thomas's knee as they watched television. Most significantly, Alexander had started looking at Thomas with an intensity that made Thomas feel exposed and cherished simultaneously. During conversations, Alexander's gaze would focus on Thomas's face with such attention that Thomas sometimes forgot what he'd been saying. There were moments when Alexander would stop mid-sentence, his eyes dropping to Thomas's lips before quickly looking away, his cheeks flushing with what looked like embarrassment or desire. The phrase "my favorite person" had become Alexander's constant refrain, but the way he said it had evolved. Where it had once sounded affectionate but casual, it now carried undertones that made Thomas's heart race. Alexander would say it while looking directly into Thomas's eyes, his voice soft and intimate, as if the words carried meanings beyond their surface. "You know you're my favorite person," Alexander had said one evening as they cleaned up after dinner, his hand covering Thomas's on the dish towel they'd both reached for simultaneously. The contact had sent electricity shooting up Thomas's arm, and he'd found himself staring down at their joined hands with wonder and terror. "Am I?" Thomas had asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Alexander had stepped closer, close enough that Thomas could feel the warmth radiating from his body. "You are," he'd said with such certainty that Thomas had felt his knees weaken. "You're the person I want to talk to when something good happens. You're the person I want to see first thing in the morning and last thing at night. You're the person who makes everything else make sense." The words had felt like a love confession wrapped in the safety of friendship terminology. Thomas had looked up into Alexander's eyes and had seen something there that looked remarkably like longing, like hope, like fear. For a moment, he thought Alexander might kiss him right there in their kitchen, surrounded by the domestic intimacy of shared meals and comfortable routine. Instead, Alexander had squeezed Thomas's hand gently and had stepped back, leaving Thomas breathless and confused and more hopeful than he dared to be in months. These moments of intense connection had become more frequent as the weeks passed. Alexander would find excuses to be close to Thomas, to touch him, to share intimate conversations that felt like emotional foreplay. They developed a routine of late-night talks on the couch, sitting close together in the lamplight, discussing their dreams and fears and the kind of deep philosophical questions that only emerged in the quiet hours. During one such conversation, Alexander had brought up the concept of soulmates, a topic that had made Thomas's heart pound with possibility and dread. "Do you believe in them?" Alexander had asked, his head resting against the back of the couch as he looked at Thomas with curious eyes. Thomas had considered the question carefully, aware that his answer might reveal more than he intended. "I think I believe in people who understand you so completely that being with them feels like coming home," he'd said finally. "People who see all of you and love you, not despite your flaws, but because of the whole picture you create together." Alexander had been quiet for a moment, processing Thomas's words. "That sounds lonely," he'd said eventually, "waiting for that one perfect person." Thomas had felt his chest tighten with longing and fear. "What if you're not waiting?" he'd asked softly. "What if they're already in your life, and you just haven't recognized it yet?" The question had hung between them with the weight of confession. Alexander had turned to look at Thomas directly, his eyes searching, and Thomas had seen something shift in his expression, something like recognition, like possibility, like the dawning awareness of a truth that had been hiding in plain sight. "Do you think?" Alexander had started, then stopped, shaking his head. "Never mind." "No, tell me," Thomas had said, leaning closer. "What were you going to say?" Alexander had looked down at his hands, fidgeting with the hem of his shirt. "Do you think it's possible to be in love with someone and not realize it?" he'd asked quietly. "To have feelings so deep and natural that you mistake them for something else?" The question had felt like a key turning in a lock Thomas hadn't even realized existed. His breath had caught in his throat, and he'd found himself staring at Alexander's profile in the soft lamplight, noting the vulnerability in his posture, the uncertainty in his voice. "I think," Thomas had said carefully, "that sometimes the most important feelings are the ones that feel so natural we don't question them. The ones that are just part of who we are." Alexander had looked up at him then, and Thomas had seen something in his eyes that looked like relief mixed with terror. Like a man who just realized he'd been holding the answer to a question he'd been asking his whole life. The conversation had ended there, but its implications had reverberated through their relationship in the days that followed. Alexander had become even more affectionate, more openly emotional, as if Thomas's words had given him permission to explore feelings he'd been suppressing. He'd started saying things that pushed the boundaries of friendship into territory that felt unmistakably romantic. "I don't know what I'd do without you," he'd said one morning as they shared coffee at their kitchen table, his fingers brushing against Thomas's as he passed the sugar. "Not just practically, I mean. I don't know who I'd be without you in my life." The words had made Thomas's heart soar and ache simultaneously. He'd wanted to respond with equal honesty, to confess that Alexander had become so central to his existence that imagining life without him felt impossible. Instead, he'd managed a smile and a soft, "You won't have to find out," hoping Alexander could hear the deeper meaning beneath the simple words. But with the increasing intimacy had come increasing tension. Thomas had found himself walking a tightrope between hope and fear, between the desire to push forward and the terror of destroying what they already had. Every lingering touch, every meaningful glance, every conversation that danced around the edges of confession had left him more convinced that Alexander's feelings were changing, but also more afraid of the consequences of acknowledging that change. The breaking point had come on a Saturday evening in early May. They'd spent the day together, running errands and enjoying the spring weather, falling into the comfortable rhythm of a couple without acknowledging that's what they resembled. Alexander had been particularly affectionate, his hand finding Thomas's as they walked, his arm slipping around Thomas's waist as they waited in line at the grocery store. That evening, they'd settled onto the couch to watch a movie, but neither of them had been paying much attention to the screen. Instead, they'd been focused on each other, on the way Alexander had gradually moved closer until he was pressed against Thomas's side, on the way Thomas's arm had come up to wrap around Alexander's shoulders, on the way their breathing had synchronized in the quiet intimacy of their shared space. Halfway through the movie, Alexander had tilted his head up to look at Thomas, his eyes soft and searching in the flickering light from the television. "Thomas," he'd said quietly, his voice carrying an urgency that made Thomas's heart skip. "Yeah," Thomas had replied, his own voice rougher than usual. Alexander had been quiet for a moment, as if gathering courage. "I need to tell you something," he'd said finally. "Something I've been trying to understand about myself." Thomas had felt his pulse quicken, hope and terror warring in his chest. He'd turned to face Alexander more fully, giving him complete attention. "Okay," he'd said softly. Alexander had taken a shaky breath, his eyes never leaving Thomas's face. "I think," he'd started, then stopped, shaking his head. "This is going to sound crazy. Nothing you could say would sound crazy to me," Thomas had assured him, meaning it completely. Alexander had looked down at his hands, then back up at Thomas's face. "I think I might be in love with you," he'd said in a rush, as if the words had been fighting to escape. "I think I have been for a while, and I just didn't understand what it was." The confession had hit Thomas like a physical blow, stealing his breath and making his heart race so fast he'd felt dizzy. He'd stared at Alexander's face, noting the fear and hope warring in his expression, the way his hands were trembling slightly, the vulnerability in his posture. "Alexander," Thomas had whispered, his voice full of wonder and disbelief. "I know it's complicated," Alexander had continued, his words tumbling over each other in his haste to explain. "I know I've never been with a man before. I know this probably seems like it's coming out of nowhere. But when I think about what I want, when I imagine my future, when I think about the person I want to build a life with, It's you. It's always been you. I just didn't understand what that meant. Thomas had felt tears prick at the corners of his eyes, overwhelmed by the magnitude of Alexander's confession, by the courage it had taken to voice such vulnerable truths. He'd reached out to cup Alexander's face in his hands, his thumbs brushing across his cheekbones. It doesn't seem like it's coming out of nowhere, Thomas had said softly. Not to me, say. Alexander's eyes had widened with hope and surprise. What do you mean, he'd asked. Thomas had taken a deep breath, knowing that his next words would change everything between them. I mean, I've been in love with you for 2 years and 4 months, he'd said, his voice steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm him. I mean, I've been watching you discover something I've known about myself since the day we met. I mean, you're not crazy, and you're not imagining things, and you're definitely not alone in feeling this way. The relief that had washed over Alexander's face had been beautiful to witness. His eyes had filled with tears, and he'd leaned into Thomas's touch as if it was the anchor he'd been searching for without knowing it. 2 years and 4 months, Alexander had repeated, wonder in his voice. You've been carrying this alone for that long. Thomas had nodded, his own eyes bright with unshed tears. I thought you were straight, he'd said simply. I thought it was hopeless. I thought the best I could do was be your friend and try to be grateful for that much. Alexander had shaken his head, his hands coming up to cover Thomas's where they still cupped his face. I was straight, he'd said, or I thought I was. But looking back now, I think I was just trying to fit into a shape that was never meant for me. Every relationship I had felt like I was playing a part, like I was trying to convince myself I felt things I didn't really feel. And now, Thomas had asked, his heart in his throat. Now I understand why nothing ever felt right, Alexander had said, his voice soft but certain. Because I was looking for you in all the wrong places. Because the person I actually wanted was right here. And I was too scared, or too blind, or too convinced I knew who I was supposed to be to see it. The words had hung between them, like a bridge finally ready to be crossed. Thomas had felt the last of his reservations crumble, replaced by a joy so pure and overwhelming it had taken his breath away. Can I kiss you? Alexander had asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Thomas had nodded, not trusting his voice to work properly. Alexander had leaned forward slowly, giving Thomas time to change his mind, to pull away, to maintain the safety of their friendship. Instead, Thomas had met him halfway, their lips touching in a kiss that had felt like coming home and starting an adventure simultaneously. The kiss had been tentative at first, soft and questioning, both of them overwhelmed by the reality of finally crossing the line they'd been dancing around for months. But as the initial shock had worn off, the kiss had deepened, becoming more certain and urgent, as if they were trying to make up for all the time they'd spent not kissing, all the moments of longing and restraint and careful distance. When they'd finally broken apart, both breathing heavily, Alexander had rested his forehead against Thomas's, his eyes closed as if he was trying to process the magnitude of what had just happened. Wow, Alexander had whispered, his voice full of wonder. Yeah, Thomas had agreed, his own voice rough with emotion. Wow. They'd sat there for a moment, foreheads touching, sharing breath and space and the overwhelming reality of having finally acknowledged what had been building between them for so long. I'm scared, Alexander had admitted quietly, his eyes still closed. Me too, Thomas had replied, his hand still cradling Alexander's face. But good scared or bad scared? Alexander had opened his eyes then, looking directly into Thomas's with an intensity that had made Thomas's heart skip. Good scared, he'd said with certainty. Definitely good scared. They'd kissed again then, longer and deeper, with less hesitation and more certainty. Thomas had felt years of careful control and hidden longing finally release, replaced by the overwhelming joy of being wanted in return, of having his love reciprocated by the person who mattered most. When they'd separated again, Alexander had smiled, the first completely unguarded, genuinely happy smile Thomas had seen from him in months. So what happens now? Alexander had asked, his hands finding Thomas's and intertwining their fingers. Thomas had looked down at their joined hands, marveling at how natural it felt. How right. Now we figure it out together, he'd said, one day at a time. Alexander had nodded, his smile growing wider. I like the sound of that, he'd said, figuring it out together. They'd spent the rest of the evening on the couch, talking and kissing, and marveling at how easy it felt to be honest with each other, how natural this new dynamic was despite its newness. Alexander had confessed his growing awareness of his attraction to Thomas over the past few months, the confusion and fear and gradual acceptance that had led to his confession. I kept telling myself I was just appreciating you as a friend, Alexander had explained, his head resting on Thomas's shoulder as they talked. But friends don't usually spend hours thinking about what it would be like to kiss each other. Friends don't usually feel jealous when their roommate goes on dates with other people. You were jealous, Thomas had asked, surprised and pleased by the admission. Insanely jealous, Alexander had confirmed, laughing at himself. I couldn't understand why the thought of you with someone else made me feel like I was being turned inside out. I thought I was just being possessive as a friend, but looking back, it was so obviously more than that. The conversation had continued late into the night, both of them eager to share thoughts and feelings they'd been keeping hidden, to explore this new territory they'd discovered together. By the time they'd finally gone to bed, separately but with the promise of more conversations and more kisses to come, Thomas had felt lighter than he had in years. The days that followed had been a revelation. Alexander had thrown himself into exploring his new understanding of himself with the same enthusiasm he brought to everything else in his life. He'd been openly affectionate, no longer hiding behind the pretense of casual friendship. He'd started kissing Thomas good morning and good night, holding his hand while they watched television, wrapping his arms around him from behind while Thomas cooked dinner. Most importantly, Alexander had seemed genuinely happy in a way Thomas had never seen before. The restless energy that had characterized him for months had been replaced by a sense of contentment and certainty that was beautiful to witness. I feel like myself for the first time in my life, Alexander had told Thomas one evening, as they shared dinner at their kitchen table. Like I finally understand who I'm supposed to be. The words had filled Thomas with such profound happiness that he'd had to set down his fork and just look at Alexander for a moment, marveling at the true and peace in his expression. But their newfound happiness hadn't existed in a vacuum. There had been practical considerations to navigate, conversations to have, adjustments to make. Alexander had needed to process his evolving understanding of his sexuality, to reconcile this new knowledge with his previous self-perception. Thomas had needed to adjust to having his deepest wishes fulfilled after so long spent believing they were impossible. They talked extensively about what their relationship meant, how to define it, what they wanted from each other going forward. Alexander had been clear that this wasn't experimentation or curiosity for him, but a genuine recognition of love that had been hiding beneath the surface of their friendship. I'm not questioning whether I'm attracted to men in general, Alexander had explained during one of their many late-night conversations. I'm not even sure that matters. What I know is that I'm attracted to you, specifically and completely. What I know is that I love you in a way I've never loved anyone else. The specificity of Alexander's feelings had been both reassuring and deeply romantic. Thomas had never needed Alexander to identify as gay or bisexual or any particular label. What had mattered was the sincerity of his feelings, the certainty in his voice when he said he loved Thomas, the way he'd embraced their relationship without reservation or regret. 3 weeks after their first kiss, they'd had the conversation about making their relationship official, about no longer hiding their feelings from friends and family. Alexander had been nervous but determined, ready to face whatever challenges might come from living authentically. I don't want to hide this, he'd said, his hand finding Thomas's across their coffee table. I don't want to pretend we're just roommates or just friends. I want people to know that you're the person I choose, that you're the most important person in my life. The conversation had led to their first public appearance as a couple, a dinner with mutual friends who had been surprised but ultimately supportive. Alexander had been visibly nervous at first, but as the evening had progressed, he'd relaxed into the role of Thomas's boyfriend with increasing comfort and obvious pride. Watching Alexander introduce him as my boyfriend to their server had filled Thomas with such profound joy that he'd had to excuse himself to the bathroom just to process the emotion privately. After 2 years of loving Alexander in secret, hearing him claim their relationship publicly had felt like a miracle. The transition hadn't been without its challenges. Alexander had moments of doubt, not about his feelings for Thomas, but about his ability to navigate this new understanding of himself. There had been conversations about internalized expectations, about the fear of judgment, about the courage required to live authentically when it meant contradicting everything he'd previously believed about himself. During one particularly vulnerable moment, Alexander had confessed his fear that he was somehow betraying his former self, that accepting his love for Thomas meant admitting he'd been living a lie for years. Thomas had held him close during that conversation, offering reassurance and perspective. "You weren't living a lie," he'd said gently. "You were living the truth you understood at the time. People grow and change and discover new things about themselves. That doesn't make your past invalid. It just makes your present more authentic." The words had seemed to resonate with Alexander, helping him process his evolving self-understanding with more compassion and less judgment. As spring had turned to summer, their relationship had settled into a comfortable rhythm that felt both new and timeless. They'd maintained many of the domestic routines they'd established as roommates while adding the intimacy and affection of romantic partners. Their apartment had truly become a home, filled with the easy comfort of two people who genuinely enjoyed each other's company. Alexander had proven to be as thoughtful and attentive a boyfriend as he'd been a friend, perhaps more so now that he could express his feelings openly. He'd started leaving little notes for Thomas to find, bringing him coffee in bed on weekend mornings, planning small surprises that showed how well he knew and appreciated Thomas's preferences. Thomas, for his part, had reveled in being able to love Alexander openly, without the careful restraint that had characterized their friendship. He'd been able to express his affection through touch and words and gestures, to show Alexander how precious he was without fear of revealing too much. Their physical relationship had developed naturally and without pressure, both of them content to explore their attraction at their own pace. Alexander had been curious and enthusiastic, approaching intimacy with Thomas with the same genuine interest he brought to everything else that mattered to him. "I never understood what people meant when they talked about chemistry," Alexander had said one evening as they lay together on the couch, Thomas's head on his chest, both of them drowsy and content. "But this makes sense of everything I never understood before." The words had perfectly captured Thomas's own feelings. Their physical connection had felt as natural and right as their emotional one, another piece of evidence that they were meant to be together in exactly this way. By midsummer, they'd fallen into patterns that felt like they'd been together for years rather than months. Alexander had claimed half of Thomas's closet space, and Thomas had started keeping his books on Alexander's nightstand. They developed morning routines that involved shared showers and collaborative breakfast preparation, evening rituals that included cooking together and debriefing about their days. Most significantly, they'd both begun talking about their future in terms of we rather than I. Plans for vacations, career decisions, living arrangements, all of it had become collaborative considerations rather than individual choices. "I've been thinking about grad school," Alexander had mentioned one evening as they cleaned up after dinner. "There's a program I'm interested in, but it would mean moving across the country for 2 years." The old Thomas would have felt his heart sink at such news, would have prepared himself for the inevitable loss of Alexander's presence in his life. But the new Thomas, secure in Alexander's love and commitment, had simply asked, "Do you want me to come with you?" The relief and joy on Alexander's face had been answer enough, but Alexander had still said more than anything. "I can't imagine doing this without you. I don't want to imagine doing anything without you." They'd spent the rest of the evening researching programs and cities, making plans that assumed their continued partnership, building a future that included both of them as equal participants. The conversation had marked another milestone in their relationship, the point at which they'd both fully committed to building a life together, rather than simply enjoying their present happiness. As summer had progressed into early fall, Thomas had found himself marveling at how completely his life had transformed. The quiet desperation that had characterized his hidden love for Alexander had been replaced by a deep sense of contentment and security. He'd gone from believing his feelings were hopeless to living in the daily reality of having them reciprocated and celebrated. Alexander, too, had continued to flourish in their relationship. The restless searching that had marked his earlier relationships had been replaced by a sense of having found his place, his person, his home. He'd thrown himself into loving Thomas with the same intensity he brought to everything else that mattered to him. "You know what I love most about us," Alexander had said one evening as they sat together on their balcony, watching the sunset and sharing a bottle of wine. "I love that loving you doesn't feel like work. It doesn't feel like I'm trying to convince myself of something or forcing myself to feel things I don't actually feel. It just feels like the most natural thing in the world. The words had perfectly encapsulated Thomas's own experience of their relationship. After years of believing love had to involve struggle and uncertainty and constant effort, being with Alexander had felt like discovering that love could also be easy and natural and joyful. That evening on the balcony had been followed by one of their most intimate conversations yet, a discussion about the future that had left both of them feeling even more connected and committed to each other. "I want to marry you someday," Alexander had said, his voice soft but certain in the gathering darkness. "I know it's early to be talking about marriage, but I want you to know that's where my heart is. This isn't temporary for me, Thomas. This isn't something I'm going to outgrow or get tired of. This is it for me." The confession had filled Thomas with such overwhelming happiness that he'd had to set down his wine glass to avoid dropping it. He'd turned to face Alexander fully, noting the vulnerability in his expression, the courage it had taken to voice such a significant declaration. "It's not too early," Thomas had said, his own voice thick with emotion. "And yes, someday I want to marry you too. I want everything with you, Alexander. The whole life, the whole future, everything." They'd kiss then, soft and sweet and full of promise, sealing their commitment to each other under the stars. It had felt like the most natural progression in the world, the inevitable result of love that had been building for so long and had finally been allowed to flourish. The months that followed had been characterized by deepening intimacy and increasing certainty about their future together. They'd started making concrete plans for Alexander's graduate school applications, researching cities and programs with the assumption that they'd be moving together. They'd begun talking about marriage in specific rather than hypothetical terms, discussing timelines and preferences in the kind of wedding they might want. Most importantly, they'd continued to grow individually while growing together as a couple. Alexander had embraced his evolving understanding of himself with increasing confidence, no longer questioning his feelings or his identity, but simply living authentically. Thomas had learned to accept happiness without waiting for it to be taken away, to trust in Alexander's love without constantly seeking reassurance. Their relationship had become a source of strength and joy for both of them, a foundation from which they could pursue their individual goals while maintaining their connection to each other. By the time winter had arrived, they'd been together for 8 months, though their emotional connection stretched back much further. They'd settled into the comfortable rhythms of a committed couple, secure in their love and excited about their shared future. The phrase that had started it all, "You're my favorite person," had evolved into something even more meaningful. Alexander still said it regularly, but now it carried the weight of their entire relationship, the acknowledgement and of everything they'd discovered together. "You're my favorite person," Alexander had said one snowy December evening as they decorated their Christmas tree together, the words carrying all the love and commitment and gratitude they'd both learned to express freely. "You're mine too," Thomas had replied as he had countless times before, the response as natural as breathing. But that night, Alexander had added something new. "You're not just my favorite person," he'd said, his arms wrapping around Thomas from behind as they both looked at their tree, twinkling with lights and memories and promises of many more holidays to come. "You're my person, period. The only person I want to share all of this with." The words had settled over them like a benediction, a recognition of how far they'd traveled together and how much further they planned to go. Standing there in their living room, surrounded by the evidence of the life they'd built together, Thomas had marveled at the journey that had brought them to this moment. From his quiet, hopeless love, through Alexander's confused searching to their mutual recognition and acceptance of what they meant to each other, it had been a story of patience and courage, and the kind of love that transforms everything it touches. As they'd finished decorating their tree that night, Thomas had found himself thinking about all the moments that had led them here, the late-night conversations that had revealed their hearts to each other, the gradual increase in physical affection that had prepared them both for the transition from friendship to romance, the courage Alexander had shown in questioning his assumptions about himself, and the patience Thomas had demonstrated in loving without expectation of return. Most of all, he'd thought about the phrase that had become their touchstone, the simple declaration that had carried so much meaning throughout their journey. "You're my favorite person" had been Alexander's way of expressing feelings he hadn't yet understood, a safe way to voice love that felt too dangerous to acknowledge directly. Now, months later, the phrase had evolved into something even more beautiful. It had become a reminder of their history, a celebration of their present, and a promise about their future. Every time Alexander said it, Thomas heard not just the words, but the entire story they represented, the journey from confusion to clarity, from friendship to love, from uncertainty to commitment. That night, as they turned off the lights and headed to bed together, Alexander had stopped in the doorway of their bedroom and had turned to face Thomas with an expression of such pure happiness that it had taken Thomas's breath away. "Thank you," Alexander had said softly. "For what?" Thomas had asked, though his heart had already been full just from seeing Alexander's joy. "For waiting," Alexander had replied, "for being patient with me while I figured out who I was. For loving me even when I didn't understand what that meant. For being exactly the person I needed, exactly when I needed you." The words had been so heartfelt, so genuine, that Thomas had felt tears prick at the corners of his eyes. He'd stepped closer to Alexander, cupping his face in his hands the way he had that first night they'd kissed. "Thank you for being brave enough to figure it out," Thomas had replied. "For being willing to question everything you thought you knew about yourself. For choosing love even when it was scary and complicated and different from what you'd planned." They'd kissed then, soft and sweet and full of gratitude for the journey that had brought them together. It had been a perfect ending to a perfect evening, a moment that had captured everything beautiful about their relationship. As they'd settled into bed together that night, Alexander's arm around Thomas's waist, Thomas's head on Alexander's shoulder, Thomas had reflected on how completely his life had changed. The man he'd loved in secret for so long was now his partner in every sense of the word, his companion for quiet evenings and exciting adventures, his collaborator in building a future they both wanted. The hopeless longing that had once characterized his feelings for Alexander had been replaced by the deep satisfaction of mutual love and commitment. The careful distance he'd once maintained to protect their friendship had given way to the easy intimacy of two people who belonged together. Most remarkably, Alexander's journey of self-discovery had led him not away from Thomas, but directly to him. The confusion and restlessness that had marked Alexander's earlier relationships had resolved into clarity and contentment once he'd understood his own heart. "I love you," Alexander had whispered in the darkness, his voice soft with sleep and satisfaction. "I love you too," Thomas had replied, the words carrying the weight of years of hidden feeling and months of shared joy. As Thomas had drifted off to sleep that night, surrounded by the warmth of Alexander's presence and the security of their love, he'd marveled at the unexpected ways life could unfold. He'd spent so long believing his feelings were hopeless that loving Alexander meant accepting a future of quiet longing and careful friendship. Instead, he discovered that sometimes the most impossible dreams do come true, that sometimes the person you love most discovers they love you back, that sometimes patience and courage and genuine affection are rewarded with the kind of happiness you never dared to hope for. Their story had become a testament to the power of authentic feeling, to the courage required to live honestly, to the beautiful ways love can transform and heal and create new possibilities. From Alexander's confused searching to Thomas's patient waiting to their mutual recognition of what they meant to each other, every step of their journey had been necessary, had prepared them for the love they now shared. The phrase, "you're my favorite person," had become more than just words between them. It had become a symbol of their entire relationship, a reminder of how love can hide in plain sight, waiting for the courage and wisdom to recognize it. Every time Alexander said it now, Thomas heard not just affection, but gratitude, not just love, but wonder at the journey that had brought them together. As winter deepened around their warm apartment, filled with the evidence of their shared life and shared love, Thomas knew that their story was really just beginning. They had years ahead of them to explore and grow and build the future they had started planning together. They had adventures to share, challenges to face as partners, joys to celebrate as a team. But in quiet moments like these, wrapped in Alexander's arms in the darkness of their bedroom, Thomas allowed himself to savor the simple miracle of being loved by the person who mattered most. The man who had once been his impossible dream had become his daily reality, his partner in everything that mattered, his favorite person in the truest and most complete sense of the phrase. Their love story had begun with confusion and longing, had developed through patience and courage, and had blossomed into the kind of partnership that made everything else in life more meaningful. It was a story of two people finding their way to each other, despite obstacles and uncertainty, of love that was strong enough to transform understanding and brave enough to embrace change. And as Thomas fell asleep that night, secure in Alexander's love and excited about their shared future, he knew that the best parts of their story were still to come. They had found each other, claimed each other, chosen each other. Now they had the rest of their lives to explore what that meant, to build on the foundation they'd created, to love each other through all the seasons and changes and adventures that lay ahead. "You're my favorite person," Alexander murmured one more time in the darkness, the words carrying all the love and commitment and gratitude that had brought them to this moment. "Forever and always," Thomas whispered back, sealing their promise to each other with words that meant everything, with love that had transformed them both, with the kind of happiness that made every moment of waiting and wondering and hoping worthwhile. Their story had become a testament to the truth that love, real love, finds a way. It had found them, changed them, brought them together, and given them a future bright with possibility. And in the quiet contentment of their shared bed, surrounded by the life they'd built together, they both knew that being each other's favorite person was just the beginning of everything they would become together.